Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's installation for public speaking. As you can see, I'm scrolling up and down um, a, a, a document that I've actually used for a creative writing class, and it'll be kind of convenient because today we're going to talk about what I've tried to term sort of critical spirit, and I've used this critical sense or critical spirit as you prefer. There is no one correct formulation, but um, I usually talk about critical spirit when we've talked about this in class. Whenever someone asks me, you know, if for example they're supposed to speak about a given topic, or if there are any, what kind of rules can we keep in mind when speaking. And I used to say as well, the idea is that you develop your own critical sense, and it is that development of your own critical sense that is going to make your speech good. So, I've said that this is actually part of that. I would like to kind of present what I mean, sort of, I would say, with respect to a certain line of thinking in I would say mostly in English. I would say mostly literary criticism, but it can go a little bit farther than that. But let's just say in English literary criticism, and I'm gonna try to be fairly brief. I've wanted to talk about this for a little while, but we've been last week or the last 2 weeks we were very involved in the specifics of we talked about you know structure. We looked at a lot of detail at the Ocasio-Cortez speech that was included to 2 weeks ago. So we were really looking at sort of kind of like really specific strategies to how to put your ideas together. How to really how to construct your speech really concretely. And we've been spending a lot of attention on sort of you know control of your voice. We'd work on intonation, and now I think it's well, we really need to have a more discussion about I would say sort of a more general discussion about sort of um, the sort of state of mind, or the kind of the way that you can look at speaking that might enable you to be a little bit more confident in your own judgment, and that you can be more independent as far as being sure about what you think is a good thing to talk about is. So this line of this sort of this idea of critical spirit, it's sort of paradoxical because we're studying this in the context of you trying to create a speech, um, meaning I'm not trying to tell you how to analyze. We are doing an analysis, and of course you do have one analysis, and we've talked about that. But the purpose of this class isn't to sort of make you sort of more. You're not being really measured on how well you can analyze speeches, but the idea is the theory that really that I'm kind of try to echo and kind of present is this idea that to really create something, um, to create something really original, it usually begins with the fact that you've developed your critical spirit. So the idea is usually we think of criticism as being something that we apply to something that other people create, um, but um, but starting from this certain, I would say, starting from the critic we have here. Now I'm circling it. You can see I'm circling Matthew Arnold, whose book he wrote in the middle of the 19th century, Culture and Anarchy. Um, he puts forth the idea, and this is an idea that we also find, and I'll be scrolling here. I think hopefully we have Oscar Wilde, who's a late, who I haven't, he's not on their page here, but who's a late Victorian writer, and he presents this idea that echoes that of Matthew Arnold, that he has an essay called "The Critic as Artist," and he explains that, the Greeks really, the only reason they actually, he talks about the fact that they had, the Greek tragedy is a fairly marked period of creation. He says that we tend to sort of think of that Greek tragedians were able to create what they did because it was sort of the early stages of civilization. We sort of have a way of thinking about civilization, at least Western civilization, as sort of the life of organically as sort of the life of a person, and that you have a sort of creative freshness at the very beginning of a civilization. There's going to be this sort of creative freshness that is sort of, it doesn't really have much to do with thinking. It's basically sort of just a sort of an unconscious um, outpouring of emotion, really. That's just sort of, everything's very spontaneous and it's not really analyzed. And so Oscar Wilde in this essay, A Critic as Artist, says no, it's actually the opposite. It's the reason why this creation, could happen wasn't because civilization hadn't started thinking yet, right? We weren't in this pre-thinking period. It was actually because this creativity was, quite the opposite. The result of being able to really analyze and think about, and also he's the how to write good plays. And he says this was also the audience itself was the general receptivity of the audience, the ability of the audience to really, they were very kind of demanding, and they also got a very high level of pleasure out of certain plays that were very well written. The fact that such a large percentage of the audience was really capable of appreciating it, and Hassel had very thoughtful reactions to the plays, actually made that critical mindset actually led to the creation. So that's first of all this idea. That's the first thing I want to say, is that if you really develop your own, I would say, critical sense when you watch a speech, you say, well, what was good about it, what wasn't. That's going to really make you able to think about your own speeches, and it's you're gonna, it doesn't mean that your speeches aren't going to be spontaneous. It doesn't mean they're going to be cerebral. It doesn't mean they're going to be, intellectual speeches. But they might be completely improvised. But that improvisation is likely to be, probably will be more successful if it is sort of the product of, let's say, over the semester you kind of thinking about different ways to speak, and you think of, well, let's say if I were to give a speech that was very meditative or very perhaps serious, if I were to do this, I can anticipate that this isn't the kind of speech that would be as successful. So you come to the conclusion, after really kind of thinking about different possibilities, you come to the conclusion that it would be better to give a speech that is more spontaneous, for example. So it doesn't mean that you have to make serious, sort of rationalistic, dry, intellectual speeches. Actually, on the opposite, I would argue that the more you use this sort of critical, the more you really think about your speeches, and kind of really, don't lead, let's say, an idea to make a speech, you don't let it be examined, right? You kind of have to, that can actually make them much more vibrant. It can make them funnier. It can make them, it can make them sadder. It can make them, the wilder. It can, ironically, the thought that you can put in a speech can actually lead to that kind of emotion. So that's the first thing, is this idea that beware of this sort of dichotomy between thinking and feeling. And we're going to come up to this, and just because you're thinking doesn't mean, in a sense, the more you think, the more interesting emotions, or sometimes stronger emotions, and combinations of emotions, you can come up with. So so let's see so we're going to start really. But I'm going to talk about the Matthew Arnold and the cultural anarchy. I might talk about some other essays by him, but I'm going to try to give you a general idea of how this could perhaps lead you to give you some ideas about how to think about speeches and how to make sort of your own decisions that you find convincing and that are going to lead you to to give a more engaging speeches. So this idea of thinking and feeling. Um, so Matthew Arnold is an English critic, and he's writing in sort of the mid late 19th century, and he's writing about. Now here we have I'm scrolling up on the pages here, and we're talking about you know uh, here we're writing about English poetry here, or mostly but English writers from the Romantic period. And so we're talking about late 18th, late 19th, and you'll notice in English poetry, there's a lot of Romantic poets. Right? This is here we're talking about. There's sort of the six most famous the men, and unfortunately it's a very kind of a masculine era for especially because English literature isn't as masculine as many as for example French literature. So it's a shame, but in the Romantic period, you're probably well aware of the fact that there is a real it's dangerous to oversimplify, but there is a lot of accent placed on feeling, right? The preceding period, who we can see here, is the sort of notice we're only I have very few poets here that I'm illustrated, which is called the Classical Augustan age. We're talking about sort of it could be the late 17th to 18th through the 18th century. There's we have this poet here, Alexander Pope. The most of these six Romantic poets, with the exception of Byron, so it's a Shelley, you have Keats, Coleridge, and Wordsworth, Blake. All five of the six, right, of these poets are very critical of 18th century poets, and of which Alexander Pope, because these Romantic poets claimed that the poets of the preceding generation wrote very well constructed verse that was well mannered, that was very controlled, but that it was a little bit too rational, right? That didn't appeal to. It was very conscious. It wasn't at all subconscious. It didn't appeal to sort of the darker, deeper subconscious feelings and sort of premonitions. And it was also and someone, especially Wordsworth, is going to level the criticism against 18th century poets that they weren't very feeling, right? That they were sort of unfeeling. There's this idea that and I'm simplifying because it isn't quite so simple, that that starting from the Romantic period, that poetry really is supposed to bring about a very I would say intenser feeling that is, and also real lived feeling. It's not a sort of an artificial construction, but the poet is much more is supposed to sort of live through the things that they're writing about. They're supposed to sort of relate these very intense personal experiences, as opposed to sort of constructing characters that might not have sort of intense emotions that the writer feels close to. So the sort of accent put on feeling, right, is something that Matthew Arnold sort of criticizes, because he says that at this time, there's the poetry kind of became lopsided. He says that the emotion that this sort of feeling emotion actually becomes very monotonous, right? The sort of intensity, if it is not sort of, I would say, counterbalanced by different using sort of different shades. Uh, I would say sometimes, for example, the absence of humor sometimes, or the fact that the lighter mode is sort of neglected, can lead to sort of a really um, lopsided mood in the poetry. And it can lead to the reader feeling that it's sort of not complete, and also that the reader might feel as if he or she is sort of stuck in this sort of closed world, a sort of a solipsistic universe that isn't really as open as it could be, because we're kind of trapped within sort of these intense emotions of individual poets. So and I'm coming back to Matthew Arnold, and he says he says it's sort of unfortunate that English poetry, this is sort of the strong period of this. Here I'm looking at the Romantic poets, and you'll notice that, for example, compared to French poetry, that it's nice to be able to make these comparisons, because take advantage of your native tongue. French Romantic poets are less. There are less, really, I would say, of the most esteemed poets in France are from the Romantic period, and more from the mid 19th century, which would be the Victorian period. And so there seems to be a really heavy accent on this sort of really uh, very sort of emphatic the writers from this period who write sort of more emphatically, whereas it's different in France. So 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 I'm coming back to Matthew Arnold is saying that the and unfortunately the this sort of, and it's important to note that that he criticizes actually the pride of the English in their own literary tradition. And he says that, for example, because it is true, if you know for many English people who English speaking people from English speaking countries, but he's really concerned mostly with the English themselves. They're likely to feel they do be, first of all, these writers here are very influenced by, you're all aware of, certainly William Shakespeare, but there is this idea that during this period, these writers were less concerned with, let's say, writers from other countries. They were becoming a little bit too smug and self-satisfied with the English literary tradition, and not as open to foreign ones, and they became very sort of engulfed in sort of their own local experience. And he's saying that it's really important for writers to once again develop more of a critical sense to their own writing, as opposed to being sort of indulgent with themselves, and sort of being committed just to um, uh, relating sort of the outpouring of emotion. They should really um, try to develop awareness of, let's say, what writers might be doing in different countries, and really sort of explore other modes of expression. So making, and he's really the one who is most critical of this sort of closeness of the English tradition, how it can be sort of closed on itself. And so there is this paradox, and so we actually, because of this sort of the paradox of sort of, I would say, the English criticism, he's sort of one of the people who kind of really makes English criticism much, I would say, for lack of a better word, more interesting than it is the paradox is that there's this the moment, really it's the moment when, let's say, a national literature begins to almost feel insecure and sort of look at other literatures. It becomes a little bit more reflexive and less heavy, and I would say sort of stuck in its own mentality. So the irony of it is, English literature and tradition kind of wakes up, according to Arnold, at the at the time when it becomes sort of doubtful of what it is, the time when it starts to call into question a lot of the assumptions that it's made. So up until really Matthew Arnold's, well, either it's true that there are, the sort of classical critics from, let's say, here once again we're looking at the Romantic period. I'm circling it here. That yes, it was true that the older critics were not really accepting of the Romantic writers, but then they became, in, I would say, many literary circles became very sort of accepted as the sort of high watermark for English literature. And this there needed to be sort of a time when this assumption, that was just sort of an assumption, these are the best English writers, and this is sort of the high point, that 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 sort of assumption needed sort of to be called into question, and that means what that implies that there needs this whole idea of just the validity of the outpouring of emotion as sort of the basis for poetry, that should be called into question, right? That it shouldn't be just assumed that is because that's what that kind of writing is associated with, sort of one of the more important periods of English poetry. It shouldn't be assumed that is what poetry just does. That we should ask yourself, well, what else can it do? Perhaps it could be used to, let's say, we could have satire, which means you can have a narrative poem making fun of a society. There's a lot of different modes, right? That are more social modes, right? Here we're talking about isolated individuals. There's a lot of different modes to that really we can take into account. So that's in a sense the sort of starting point for this whole idea of critical thought, and this idea is really kind of what I would say the critic and poet who is the sort of the descendant of Matthew Arnold. One of the is the American, the American poet T.S. Eliot, who I'm circling here. So I've listened. You have listed some of his books. It's really excellent criticism. But he follows this idea, and he has a whole. He sort of reevaluates the history of English poetry, and very much from a few points of view, very much in keeping with Matthew Arnold, and it's interesting is he's very very much a historian of the English tradition, but at the same time his poetry itself is really wildly radical. There's if you've ever read The Wasteland, you'll notice that it's pushing all the limits of grammar and really avant-garde in a lot of respects. And I would say one of the central ideas that T.S. Eliot talks about is what he calls the danger of what he calls the dissociation of sensibility, and this is the moment where T.S. Eliot, in his rewriting of sort of the English tradition, now we're looking back to, so here I'm doing T.S. Eliot, his version, his history of English poetry, is going to be let's say we're going to have Shakespeare at the heart, right? And he says, when Shakespeare, there was one of the great merits of Shakespeare is this idea that thinking and feeling are never dissociated. When you read through a Shakespeare sonnet, there's going to be very when you move from one quatrain to another, there's going to be very subtle shifts in, the grammar is going to lead to a metaphor that is going to be embedded in another metaphor, and you really have to, there's a lot of thinking involved, right? And there's no way that you can, have the full emotional effect without really following all the intricacies of Shakespeare's thought. So that there's this idea that you don't just it's not about just a simple outlet of emotion, just letting the emotion out. It's about sort of following very often you have to really use your mind to follow an idea, and in following your idea with the mind, that is how certain emotions are created. I think we could say. So T.S. Eliot says that that's one of the high points of in English literature, and he says but the right immediately afterwards he refers to John Donne, who I'm circling here, who according to I'm not sorry John Donne, I'm sorry John Milton, excuse me. So John Milton, who's writing in the mid, the following generation, starting from the mid 17th century, and Milton, um, he's a great master of sort of sound. Milton is a master of sound. He created sort of what is called the verse paragraph, and there's this when you read Milton, you're sort of the rhythm and the assonance and all the echoes kind of puts you into almost into a sleep. It's sort of it's sort of it's a spell. You can think of it's sort of like a magician who uses sound to cast a spell over you, right? And according to Eliot, the great attention that Milton spent to sound, right, had the effect of you don't need to be thinking, you only just need to be hearing to feel, right? So it's so all the this is Eliot's idea. This is the first essay, not the second essay on Milton. He according to Eliot, according to this idea that with Shakespeare and also in his time, because he's also talking about the English metaphysical poets who I'm circling here, John Donne, Shakespeare, and the metaphysical poets such as John Donne, thinking and feeling are not associated with Milton. The accent that is given to sound at the expense of the meaning of the words, the real value of the words, according to Eliot, words are chosen more for their sound than for their meaning. So this leads there to be a dissociation between feeling and thinking, and that's the main idea of T.S. Eliot, of this idea of dissociation of sensibility. And he claims that this divorce between thinking and feeling actually continues all through the 18th century, and much of it because of the influence of Milton. This way of writing that is really devoted to sound without really while neglecting the intricacies of thought. And Eliot also says that continue, and that this continues through the Romantic period. So the Romantic writers, the six of them who we discussed here, continued in Milton's vein. They continued to devote much more attention to the sound than thinking. And it is only really, what he's really saying, it's only when he's writing, only until the early 20th century, that with such writers as, I can hear the modernist writers from the early 20th century, that I'm simplifying his thesis, but that really that the intricacies of sound and thought become wed, and it means that the poetry is sort of more alive. It's sort of it's appealing to it's appealing to many more aspects of life, of the sort of the shades of meaning or related to shades of feeling that are very often not over, how to say, over, what we say, hackneyed, overused. There are sort of zones of thought and feeling that are not at all common, that are kind of valuable and not are sort of ignored in a sense. This period, according to, and it's actually true. It's a remarkable period for English poetry. At this period, the early 20th century, there's this sort of an expansion of shades of meaning and mood, and this is sort of has to do with the fact that according to Eliot, and this much of it is true, that thinking and feeling become sort of wedded together. So that's sort of the I would say that these are Eliot and so Matthew Arnold, T.S. Eliot, I'm circling him here. That can kind of give you the key to sort of this vein of critical thought, this idea of developing a critical sense, and it sort of has to do with, I would say, being sort of self-critical, right? Saying, well, this is, an idea that I like, but, really asking yourself, well, let's say I might like this idea because this is my own little experience of life, but, and this is a little bit very related to this idea of dialogism that we saw, is, um, maybe there's, I could go farther with this idea. Maybe I can look at it completely different, and I could adopt another perspective, right? Maybe, and really kind of put it to the test, and to kind of work with that idea, and then what comes out of that sort of, that what we could call analysis, right? Um, that can lead to a much more engaging creation, according to this line of thought. And so that's sort of the idea of the sort of Matthew Arnold developing the sort of self-critical spirit, not being self-satisfied, as the English are self-satisfied. They have to look. Matthew Arnold really says, England has become too much of an island. English people should read more German writers, and French writers and Italian writers, um, and and really, in reading these German writers and French writers, ask themselves, well, wait, this our tradition, our English tradition is weaker in this aspect. How can we borrow from something? So you're seeing it's being self-critical, that you can borrow from something that isn't just yourself. So it doesn't mean you have to be sort of overly self-critical and unsure of yourself, but it can sort of lead you to explore and explore different areas, and also look at things from a different angle, not your own angle. Try to look at things from another angle, and that's sort of the beginning of sort of what we could call modern, according to me at least. This is sort of this tradition is not as taught as it used to be, but that's I would argue that it is, one of the major beginnings of critical thought, and the real, probably the person who has kind of extended this idea, and that you can kind of use this, would be, I would say, T.S. Eliot, with this idea of, um, um, not dissociating thinking and feeling. This critical. Ask yourself, wait a second, is there two? Is this speech? Is this only about just me thinking? Is this only sort of an intellectual speech? But is there any feeling going on? And what is that relationship? How can what is the range of emotion, and how can we, exploring this idea, lead us to feel something, or to in sort of a involvement with the audience that we might not have had. So that is our little, the little sketch of what we know what I'd like to call the English sort of critical tradition. And as I said, it's a much more, these are sort of more general considerations. Hopefully you're able to this will help you even think of your specific speeches. I know it might seem a little bit abstract, but I think it's important to sort of at least be aware of this, because I don't think it's taught very much. And once again, in this class, try to think, if you hopefully have the leisure to read I would try to maybe read some of these. I would definitely suggest the T.S. Eliot, The Sacred Wood, his collection of essays, and Matthew Arnold. You could read his Culture and Anarchy. You might enjoy this, and but if you don't, you obviously don't. It's up to you whether you'd like to read these writers or not. It's always better if you feel like, if you really want to, but maybe perhaps this idea is applicable to your speeches. So we'll leave it at that, and we will have our next week. We'll have our class together en présentiel, as we say. So take care.